Hello, everyone. I'm talking with Fess, which is go ahead, you say it.
It's
Fess.
in nomine patris et filii et spiritus sancti. So
Right.
it's an acronym of sorts for
Yes. It is. Yeah, the Latin bless or the name of the Father, the
right.
Son, and the Holy Spirit. Right. Okay.
Exactly.
So here we are. We're going to do a little discussion for our favorite forum, Tradcath, and we wanted to discuss some of the things. There's the one thing called the paradox you were talking about. Traditionalists have to
Yes.
have there's a bit of a paradox that you feel, and what I'd like you to do is I'm going to reference this to that thread, this recording, so it makes sense to everybody, anybody who's interested, I should say, and so why don't you explain if you had some time to think about it because we talked the other day about I really don't see a paradox and to the date as of reading, I still don't see a paradox. So why don't you give it a try now and see if you can get me to see the paradox of what you're talking about? And I'm not condemning it. I'm saying you probably do have one. I'm just saying I think we're going to try this way to get through to my thick skull. But go ahead.
Well, I should start from the outset by saying that there are multiple different ways that traditional Catholics arrive at the conclusion that either there is no pope for sure, or
Well,
there's
can
at
I
least
stop you at that? I'm sorry. Right away I stopped you, but I did want to ask you that. I was thinking about that today. What is your position, if you don't mind answering, vis the sedevacantist opinion?
well, my position really is, from what I can understand, it's the same as Pacelli's position on the matter. I was somewhat relieved when I saw that he held a very similar position. It's actually it doesn't dichotomize the entire question into two camps where either A, he absolutely must be the Pope, the stated Plainist position, or B, he absolutely must not be the Pope. Really, we're in an unprecedented crisis because that very question cannot be solved. We have an issue with a, for the most part, compromised authority that can't ultimately tell us for sure.
Right.
And for things like this, we need an authority to ultimately tell us so that we have the absolute certainty required to hang everything on it,
Right.
if you will. And so, in the absence of absolute certainty,
Right.
and in the absence of the only authority on earth that can give us that absolute authority, we can have our own opinions, but that's all that they really are.
Well, then you'll be happy to know that that's also my opinion because we're not. I mean, one of the reasons we started this forum and one of the reasons that Sybil's forum, past forum. But anyway, the reason that one went down was it became totally polluted with dogmatic sedevacantists. So if you were not holding this opinion, or you like me, you go to the Eastern Rite, you know where the Una Cum issue came into play. You know, you were barely Catholic, or you were part of the problem. And no, Pacelli and I weren't going to go there, and that's basically what shut down Sybil's forum. Anyway, long story short, so all three of us are in agreement on that opinion. Okay.
Yeah, there's a problem that we all see, well, many of us see anyway,
Right.
at least on this forum, with dogmatic sedevacantists who basically elevated their own private personal judgment of the
Right.
matter to the status of not just a valid theological opinion, but what they would call a dogmatic fact, where you must now assent to it, you must believe it, and there is no one is allowed to even question it. He must not be the Pope. He cannot be the Pope. It's impossible. And if you believe he is the Pope, you are at least denying a dogmatic fact, and some would go even so far as to say you are a heretic because now you are
you're part of
embracing
Yeah.
the possibility that this man, who obviously is a heretic to them, you're embracing the possibility that what he's doing would not put him outside the church. And how could you think that? They're basically saying that their opinion, as it concerns the application's theological principles to the fact, renders it so certain for them that it must be certain for you, or else you are outside of their little sedevacantist church.
Right, right.
For me, that is that is not the case. It is very anti-Catholic. We don't have the certainty that we need. That's why there's a
Well,
crisis.
don't you find it's a bit of
clear.
a bit of a case of they keep forgetting that who they are, that they're laity. I mean, it
Yes.
really it comes down to they. You know what's been so much that's been lost in all these years of this mess is that the hierarchical nature of our church is kind of dissolved. So we've actually, a lot of them, even the trad seeds and everything, don't realize it, but they've embraced the egalitarian democracy of it all, that, it's the people's church, or, just like the Novus Ordo, they believe the people are the church. And they've lost all the
Right.
hierarchical concept that the laity have, we're sheep, they're shepherds, and it's terrible, and we're afraid, and we're not sure what's going on, but we can't be stepping up and becoming shepherds ourselves.
Well, and I completely agree with that. And people object to what you just said by saying, well, look, either he is or he is the Pope, and that has practical consequences for what you do.
Correct.
You can't just ignore the question because you can't face it, or you don't want to face the implications. But, that's not what we're doing. There's without getting too technical, there's the ontological question of whether or not objectively he is or he is not the Pope. That is not going to change. God knows the answer to that question. But there is the epistemological question as well, which is how we know whether he is or not, or how we don't know whether he is or not. And ultimately, that's what we're concerned with, because in the absence of the ontological answer to the question, all we can go off really is the epistemological, and that's what information do we have that would allow us to come to a moral certainty one way or the other about the question.
Right.
And the answer to that question does have practical consequences. If you have positive, objective doubt, prudent, regulated, of course, that he is not the Pope, for one reason or another, whether it's the absence of the necessary condition of, say, his universal acceptance, or some sort of utterance of his that is obviously heretical, you are obliged to withhold or withdraw from communion with such a man. In the meantime, for the sake of your own soul,
right,
based upon certain Catholic principles, that's a practical question and has a practical answer. So you can withdraw from communion even in the absence of certainty regarding the theological question of whether he is or he isn't actually the Pope. And really, that's where I think all of us are in agreement. That's where we should all be.
Well, which we should be, right? Because it's just a matter of justice, really. And I mean, I always keep dragging it back to justice myself. Because how would God judge my opinion on the matter? Now, if I say, God, you'll have to forgive me, I couldn't believe he was the Pope because A, B, and C, and then God can reveal to me, when I'm dead, I'm talking, of course.
Exactly.
But while I'm here, I don't think I could just God could misunderstand why I'm doing it. It's in a case of that I just want to do the right thing, Lord, and right now I can't see what's going on, but I still trust you. And it's sort of like what happened when Christ was crucified. I mean, he didn't. The apostles all fled, but he didn't condemn them for it. And then in the case of Thomas, he almost insisted that he be convinced. And so I don't know. I just
it was a sign of contradiction. Absolutely.
Right. And so I guess the matter is that's kind of settled, and I think that's good, because that's the nature of our forum. That, and I'm open to people who won't even accept the sedevacantist opinion, and that's fine as long as they don't say that I'm outside the church either. It goes the other way. The ones that, well, you don't even believe in the church because you think the church failed because Francis isn't Pope. See, it goes the other way. There's traditionalists who say that to you. If you
That's a very good point.
Yeah. Okay. Well, then, that's a bit of a paradox. Then, is that the same kind of paradox you're talking about?
Well, I'm not quite sure whether it's the same. I don't know that I'd characterize it that way.
Okay.
Great segue into that
Right.
question. There are three, or I shouldn't say three. There are many more, but there are three primary ways that, in my experience, that traditional Catholics, come to the sedevacantist conclusion.
Mm-hmm.
And so the question is, there is a question of what is the best way, and then there's the question of what are the only proper ways. And I say I say proper, not in any way to condescend to somebody who comes to it a different
Right, sure.
approach.
Well, you
But
said two
there
things
are dangerous ways.
Yeah, but you've said, not to cut you off, but you said there's a proper way, and then there's, wait a minute, you said there's a proper way, and then there's the better way, or something like. Did I
Yes.
hear you right? So are they two different ways? The better way.
There are multiple ways, and
Right.
I wouldn't say that all of them are right, though. I would say that one of them is dangerous, and
Okay.
it's the one that involves the paradox, and that's the reason I felt the need to start a thread about it.
Yeah.
And I feel it's
All right,
dangerous because I used to hold it myself. And
Well, let's talk about it
It
then.
was dangerous.
Okay, fine. Let's get down to the nitty gritty on that, because I have yet reading. I did punish myself and sit through reading the whole thing, and I still didn't see the paradox. But that's more about my density than your ability to write. So don't take it personally. So try to talk me through it. What is the actual paradox that you're trying to refer?
Well, maybe I should ask you questions that
Sure.
will get you to
We'll do the
face
Socratic.
it.
We'll do the Socratic method. Go ahead.
Absolutely. So I would ask you, how do you know the teachings of the Church, or the Catholic Church, that you believe and follow? How do you know that those are safe and or true?
Wow, that's actually a very difficult question to answer, isn't it? Doesn't that go to faith?
Well, the Catholic Church is addressed it with certain rules and principles that you have to apply, and that's what the thread.
We'll
was
get back to your
getting at, is
question.
how we know the answer to
Yeah,
that
but
question.
you asked me a direct question. Let's just unpack that first. So ask me again. So you're saying, how do I know that the church? Can I shorten it to say, how do I know the church is telling me the truth, or do I have to ask the question, how do I know the church is the church?
No, you can say, how do you know that the Church is telling you the truth?
Okay. So
Now,
we're
you
assuming
believe
that
these things.
we're assuming that,
Go ahead.
but it's important for me. So I'm gonna really pick apart your question. So we're coming from the place where we can safely assume the church is the church.
Correct.
Okay. So now you're asking me, but how do I know? Well, see the circular nature of that, because if it is the church, that's why I say then it's true, because the church is telling me it. Is that right?
Okay. Well, if the Church is telling you it, that would be a teaching, correct?
Okay.
So that gets to my initial question, which is that all of the teachings of the Church, even the teaching that says that she is the Church, how do you know that that's true?
Right.
I mean, she could be. Maybe she's lying to you.
Well, you see that's what I mean.
Maybe this is the legitimate. Maybe this is the true church that Christ established. But how do you know that the specific things that they're asking you to believe are true? I mean, for what if Christ is wrong? I mean, we're asking.
Well, no, I know that.
The question
Well,
how we even arrive at the faith to begin with.
That's why I picked your question apart, because really it goes back to to say how. It really comes back, you have to ask the question then. It's not fair to go forward, how do we know the church is the church? Because that was just what you just said. How do we know that the church isn't lying to you? Because if you say the church is lying to you, then we know it's not the church. Now, is that the paradox right there?
No.
Okay.
No.
So we have. I hate to trip you up.
The church is right by saying it's the church, and my point is that just saying it's the Church of Christ doesn't mean it's right. It could be. What if Buddha started a church and you said, well, because it's his church means it's right? We don't know that Buddha was right. So just because he starts a church doesn't mean that his things are going to be true.
No. See, now we're falling over each other's definitions. When I define the church, I'm not talking about a religion. I'm talking about the church, the mystical body of Christ, as known as the Universal Catholicos Church, the thing that Christ established. Now, how do we know that Christ established it? Because the church tells us it's circular. See, so then you have to go back. It is circular, because you have to realize that then you're dropping back into it's a gift of faith. I don't know. Actually, I don't know why. I can't even tell you. If you ask me, Joe, how do you know you're awake right now? I don't know. I just know that I'm awake. This isn't a dream that I'm having a conversation with Fess and recording it. This isn't a dream I'm having. I'm really doing this. But how do I know? See, that's a real dig down deep question you can't just answer off the cuff. So
well, my post is the whole point of my post answers what the Catholic Church teaches about this question.
okay,
And the
go ahead.
Baltimore Catechism, and when you study for your First Holy Communion, teaches the answer to your question is that the Church is one, holy, Catholic, and apostolic.
Right.
So there are external marks by which you know it's
Right.
the
Right.
true Church.
All right.
But once you've gotten to identify the location, the specific institution that lays claim to this,
Okay.
what rule, what standard do you use in accepting that this particular teaching is true or not true? What if some truth? What if some of the teachings were true, but what if later on in 1,500 years afterwards, some rebel pope came up and made some false teaching and universally promulgated it upon the faithful? How would you know the difference
Now,
between it is true or it isn't true?
Right. So define you. How, when you asked me, how do you know?
How do the faithful know?
The faithful being the laity.
The laity. What's the standard that the Church uses to tell the faithful how they can know that a teaching is true or safe, and that it's not some invention from some imposter?
I guess I would say because the priest and the bishops tell me so.
You know, if I can paraphrase that,
Okay.
when you have true authority, Christ promised that he would keep that true authority
Right.
from universally promulgating error upon the entire church. Or I shouldn't even say error, but things that are going to spiritually harm us. So I use the word safe.
Right.
If it's a true authority, then it's the teaching is guaranteed to be safe.
Okay.
That's how we know what we have to believe. We know each individual content, each individual item of the faith, each individual doctrine or dogma, we know we can count on as being true because, or at least being safe. Even disciplines of disciplines of ecclesiastical law or canon law are protected from at least causing harm. So I'm trying to use a general principle to cover the least common denominator of protection, and that is at least they're safe when something's been promulgated universally and imposed upon the faithful.
Okay.
Even if it's not a dogma or a doctrine specifically, if it's something that the Church imposes upon the faithful universally, and it's the Church's authority, then we know that it can't contain anything that's going to be harmful to the faithful world. That's the standard the Church gives us.
Right. So you're arguing from authority, but not in a fallacious way. But I mean, you're arguing about what I'm saying is, does the Bible count as an authority?
Well, yes, the Bible is what gives us this insight, because obviously it was Christ who said, you know, if they don't hear
the Scripture,
they don't hear me. So he's telling them that on their authority they will hear you, and then he's saying, and I'm going to protect you so that you can't teach or promulgate error or things that are harmful at least. And the faithful can rest assured that they don't believe lies, and they can be rest assured that they are not believing things that are harmful to their salvation by knowing that I sent you, by your true authority, in other words. Knowing that I would never allow that to happen because I am going to send you the Holy Ghost who's going to protect you from any sort of harm or causing any sort of harm to the faithful. So the faithful don't have to worry about putting your text to a microscope, trying to find error, and then trying to say, you must not be a true authority. If you are a true authority, then the teaching is safe.
Sort of like the Berean,
and that's the rule
the Berean Bible churches, it's like they put to test everything you say to Scripture, or something like that.
And their interpretation of Scripture.
Right.
Ultimately subjective.
Right,
no
exactly.
Authority.
Right. So that was why I asked the question: Does the Bible count? And the reason I asked, let's say in lieu of a visible that I can locate safely and assuredly authority, which is sort of the case now. It's hard to tell who's, which is probably part of your paradox that you're coming up to explain to me, but it's hard to tell since I reject the idea that Francis is a pope, that it's hard for me to find a visible authority, ultimate authority, at this point. So then I would have to refer to the teachings of the popes previous, the teachings of saints, the catechisms before Vatican II, etc., the Scripture. The Scripture's a little different, though, because I'm not a Protestant, so I mean I can't just pick up the Bible. I may come to a wrong conclusion. about something I've read in Scripture. Are you following what I'm saying? So,
I am.
okay, so is this part of the paradox that we can't find the authority? So whereby do we judge the same authority as not trustworthy?
No,
Okay.
I've laid the ground principle or the ground premise for the paradox. I just have to turn it back on itself. But
Okay.
before I do that, let me make sure that we're going in the right direction.
Okay,
there
sure.
are three
Be
the
patient
three
with
different
me.
ways I usually speak up about approaching or coming to the conclusion of sedevacantism.
Okay.
Is one, arguing from the nature of the church. Two, arguing that the popes, the claimants at least, as individuals outside of speaking authoritatively, have uttered, spoken, professed things that are at least erroneous or heretical, and that is lies. That's a big question to their authority.
Right.
And the third way, which I believe is the worst way and the actual dangerous way, is the way where you start with a specific text from the Novus Ordo Magisterium, and you argue back to questioning the authority that gave it to you in the first place. And so,
now describe that. I'm sure I don't understand that. Describe that. What would that look like?
Well, I described it in my post. It's kind
Well,
of a doubling back on itself, which is where the paradox comes from. So, in a nutshell, the paradox is that we use the rule that the church gives us is that if the teaching comes from a true authority, then it is safe.
Okay.
The problem with that third approach is that it breaks the rule to redefine the standard. It doesn't like the teaching, so it breaks the rule that it came from at that moment before you've come to any conclusions. He's illegitimate authority. You have no reason without the other two methods. You have no reason to question his authority yet. Your only reason for questioning his authority is a tainted magisterium. So at the moment you see before you actually see the tainted magisterium, he is absolutely the true pope, because you have no other reason to suspect him yet.
Okay.
So if you're absolutely the true pope, you can't acknowledge the possibility of the tainted magisterium without violating the very rule by which you got the standard of Catholic faith to compare the Novus Ordo to in the first place.
Right. Well, I sort of that's why I asked you what would that look like, because you said what they do is that's dangerous is they grab maybe a piece of text from the Novus Ordo and then go backwards. Now I was asking what if you could create an example for me, like I don't know, something written that they. I mean, can you cite an example of someone doing this?
I would argue the most common way the traditional Catholics
all right, well then
justify their existence or their movement to begin with is they say, well, the things that Vatican II taught are wrong.
Like what?
Therefore,
like what?
They're not the popes.
I know. I'm just gonna.
Let's say Dignitatis Humanae.
All right.
Well, there's a lot of them, Gaudium et Spes, but mainly
pick one.
Teachings on religious liberty.
Okay.
Humanism.
Good one. Okay, we'll just go with the religious liberty that every man has the freedom to. What's that synthesized down to? Every man has the freedom to.
He has the personal right to profess whatever religion he wants to in the public sphere, even.
Okay, so I'm a lay person. I come across that teaching in the Vatican II documents.
And at this moment, when you come across a teaching, you think he's a true pope. You firmly believe and have no reason to question.
We'll use John Paul II. Well, who was the pope then? That was Paul VI, right? Paul VI promoted.
Correct.
Okay, so we'll say, we'll go back in time, and it's Paul VI is sitting there, and then he promulgates this, a freedom of liberty of conscience, or whatever you call it, and religious liberty, and I discover this document. Okay, go ahead, go from there. I'm sorry, I'm just trying to put context around it.
So you are John Q. Catholic who
right.
Picks up a copy of this, and there's no crisis in your mind at this point.
Right.
Yet you're just seeing this for the first time, and you believe Paul VI is the Pope. You believe he has universal acceptance. You don't believe there's a new church created yet.
Right.
You simply are looking at the document, wishing to be informed about the teachings of the church, which is what you should do as a faithful John Q. Catholic.
Right.
Your mission or your job is to identify your superior, which you have identified, and then you look to his magisterium, you see if it's universally promulgated, and at the very least you know that even if it does not intend to bind one to some sort of doctrinal or dogmatic declaration, at the very least, the following of this teaching cannot cause you harm. So you can go carry out the consequences and suggestions of this without any jeopardy to your spiritual well-being.
Is that true, or is that what you feel?
As you're reading through this document, you find this phrase that you don't understand, and it seems to you right from the outset that it is not safe, because if you did carry that out, or if you recommended that others carry it out, say non-Catholics carry it out, you would severely scandalize them and perhaps even keep them from ever becoming Catholic to begin with, because they would always embrace this right to profess other religion that is also good in certain respects, which dovetails with the ecumenism, but we won't get into that. At any point, the Catholic then says, well, even though it's a true authority, and I picked this document up knowing it's a true authority, this doesn't add up, or I can't reconcile it with previous teaching, therefore it's not previous teaching, or therefore it's not, I should say, legitimate teaching, therefore it must come from a false pope, therefore Paul VI isn't a true pope. The problem is you started with an absolute authority, the rule of the church, that gave you all the other content by which you're comparing this to doctrine, is that if it comes from a true authority, that it must be true, or must be at least safe. When you find something you don't understand, or you, instead of waiting for the theologians to tell you what it means and trusting that Christ will keep his promises, never to let his church teach something that's not safe, you use your private judgment, not you, uses his private judgment, to then break the rule, because if it comes from a true authority that's safe, well, he has what he believes is a true authority, says it's not safe, which is to claim that Christ was lying, then turn it on itself and say, therefore, not a true pope. Well, what's the point of the rule if the rule can be violated? What's the point of the protection, the infallible guarantee that the Holy Ghost would not allow this to happen, if you can simply pick up a document, and it was only a lay education, perceive doctrinal errors in it, and then use that standard to basically trump the Pope, the man that you just believed was the Pope, and say, but because you taught error, you can't be the Pope. Well, you can't say he taught error if you really trust that Christ is going to keep his promises, not to lead you into error. And there is the paradox in a nutshell, is really that you use the rule against itself, which is a logical contradiction. You have a rule that says what you can do, but when it gives you an output that you don't like, you then
Well, I have to unpack that phrase. You have to be more specific than that, because that's not a good way to put it. If it's a phrase I don't like, is a very subjective term. Let's say it doesn't offend me that way, but it's so clearly opposite of what was taught by all the other popes up to this point.
Well, they believed lots of theologians. Well, there were theologians, and there are people used to claim that what was defined at Vatican I wasn't true either.
Right.
And that's why this opens you up to all kinds of error, because there was a really good poster on fish eaters who his username began with a V. I can't remember his name.
Okay.
No, but he was a well-respected poster
Vincenzi?
No.
All right.
But
Go on.
he used this to falsify Vatican I or Vatican II first.
Right.
And then he started going through with his own lay education. He started going through church history and was finding quotes that, I should say, out of context in some respects, or the opinions of weighty theologians, or statements that could be interpreted either way. He believes that the constant teaching of the church has been that the Pope does not have the authority to by himself as an individual speak ex cathedra for the entire church and define a dogma without the unity of the bishops of the whole world. So he went on to question Vatican I, and then started just going back through history, throwing councils out, because he was taking what he perceived as being the tradition of the church, the constant teaching of the church, his subjective opinion of what that was.
Right.
And then he was finding later periods in church history where there were dogmas were pronounced that seemed to violate that. Again, seems to. And he then used it to say, well, that wasn't a true council, then that man wasn't a true pope, and the sedevacante period just keeps going back and back in time. So there are some, I believe, that go back as far as the 13th century, something like that.
Right.
This can keep going, and the
Sure,
problem is
sure.
that his arguments were very, very good arguments, and I actually had to go do some research because the quotes that he was throwing at me and everything else were so powerfully against, seemingly powerfully against what Vatican I thought, that you started wondering, like, what of the church is true and what isn't true. And the point is that when you really, you had to really look into the matter, you had to really study it and make a lot of distinctions, and then you realize the Vatican I taught wasn't contradictory to previous teaching or to the tradition of the church, the belief of the universal church. But at first it could be seen as that way.
Right.
And we have to have a standard that says we absolutely know what that is, and you shouldn't have to be a theologian to be able to do it. The most simple-minded layperson should be able to say, look, I don't know what's true or what's false. I don't know if baptism of desire was contradicted by Trent. I don't know if Trent sealed the deal on baptism of desire.
Right.
It gets into the Latin, and it's very, very complex. They have an argument for everything. Well, the Pope never signed this decree, so therefore it renders it null and void. There's an argument for everything if you want your position to be right.
Right.
And the point is to eliminate that subjectivity, that human error that does sometimes get involved when Protestants, when we want something to be a certain way, or we have a preconception about what that teaching is, we have to have some objective standard everyone knows and that everyone can appeal to that is very simple. So least common denominator, John Catholic, by which we remain united in faith and government. Because if we didn't, everyone could be objecting sedevacantist to every few sentences of a bull or of a encyclical, and the church would be as numerous as there are individuals.
All right, well, let me go contra on you then. Let me try a couple things. First off, does the intention of John Q. Catholic in our example matter? The intention, because you seem to premise it on he didn't like it, as opposed to maybe he wanted to believe it, and then no matter when he kept checking. See, I guess that's the dangerous part, is what you're saying.
Well, let me define like.
Okay.
By like, I mean it wasn't amenable to what he believed was the truth. So if I need to unpack that a little bit even further, in other words, he has about what the church teaches from what he's read and from what he's been told. He believes that this is what the church teaches, and it could be right or it could be wrong. The authority of the church is what he's supposed to be listening to.
Right.
But he looks at a few papal documents and he gets an impression about what the church teaches, and it might be right or it might be wrong. Well, then he finds this new teaching from, say, Paul V, or Vatican I, depending whichever example you want to use. We'll use Paul, since we're going with it right now.
Yeah, we'll go with this. Say with 6.
Text from Dignitatis Humanae, and it's scandalized because it doesn't reconcile with what he previously believed to be the truth. And ultimately, he doesn't know who's right. It could be right, it could be wrong. The text claims it's not changing anything in the first few paragraphs. So if he's like, well, this is a true authority, then he has every reason to believe that it's simply his insufficiency of intellect that understands how it can be reconciled. I mean, you'd say, I think his name was it Brian Harrison, maybe, who wrote the extremely long treatise on reconciling Dignitatis Humanae with previous teaching. And he went through great lengths to do it, more so than any theologian would have to do. The point being, there are very many educated Catholics who've gone along with it and who think what he said was true, and that it can be reconciled. Here is a theologian of the church, or somebody anyway, who is acting as a theologian of the church, who is actually successfully reconciles the document, and they don't know whether he's right or wrong because they're not him. Only he would know that, or someone with his intellectual acuity. They would know that.
Okay,
but
well,
the average Catholic's just going along with what they've been told is the authority of the church.
All right. So if what should John Q. Catholic have done in that situation?
If he believes that this is coming from if the Novus Ordo is in his mind, if this document is coming from the true authority, then that true authority is really the head of the church he believes is the Catholic Church,
right?
And he should submit to that teaching on a condition, and in good faith, he would be perfect concert with Catholic teaching and with Catholic epistemology he should submit to that because it is from what he believes to be a true authority. Even though he's wrong, the conclusion is wrong. What he intends is the best thing. He intends to have a Catholic attitude and not a Protestant attitude by sifting through papal documents and throwing out the things he doesn't like and accepting the things he does like.
Okay.
He should be consistent by accepting all of it if it comes from what he believes to be a true authority.
Well, which sounds like an apologetic for all the conservative Novus Ordos that we have.
It is. It
right.
is.
I mean, not that I'm condemning them.
Throw a lot of stuff out, though.
Yeah.
We can't ignore that.
But I'm not condemning them. I'm just saying that. I mean, if
there
are a lot of the strong language,
you're going to get wrong conclusions.
Right. But the thing is, there's a lot of strong opinion, and I guess I hold it. I'm not going to hide from the fact that this sect isn't actually a Catholic church, right? But so the people who are in it are not necessarily Catholics, even though in their intention, according to your previous example of what John Q. Catholic should have done, they are still Catholic and they're doing just fine. Or is that the paradox?
To an extent, yes. There's one condition I would say that I should enter in. As long as the person believes this in goodwill and in good faith, yes. I mean, if a person doesn't want to have to relocate to go to a traditional parish, and so they simply say, well, I don't want to do that, therefore it must be the true church, therefore it's a true authority, therefore it's true magisterium, therefore what it teaches is true,
right?
Then he wouldn't be right, and he wouldn't be Catholic, because what he's done is he's placed his own will above truth. And the whole nature of how truth is supposed to inform the intellect is
do you believe that if every good-intentioned Catholic, Novus Ordo or otherwise, any good Catholic, if they were given the time and the resources, would come to the same conclusions that we have? Assuming a reasonably intelligent person. I'm not talking about, somebody who's addled by disease or their brain, or complete idiots. I'm just talking about your average John Q. Catholic. If they had the resources and the time, do you believe they would come to the same conclusions that we, and good intention, honest intention to find out the truth? Do you believe all roads lead to this position?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay. So then,
I do. If the person is endowed with the virtue of consistency, of think consistently, because some people aren't as logically rooted, and so their conclusions don't go at the same place. And God accounts for all of that, and He takes care of all of that. But if the person has that the benefit of being intellectually consistent, then absolutely those resources and that time would direct their intellect to exactly what we're doing today.
Okay. So the paradox then is they are acting in a non-Catholic way, even though they come to a Catholic conclusion. Is that a fair?
Yes. Well, let me maybe break it down like this.
Okay.
They're basically taking a rule stays the same, correct?
Okay.
I mean, a rule is what it is. If the equation says there's a plus sign, then that plus sign always adds things. It's not going to sometimes subtract things.
Right.
So if the rule is that, this symbol always functions a certain way, but you can plug different facts in. The paradox is when the rule is the same, but when you plug in the facts, you get an answer I'm not going to make the mistake of saying but when it doesn't equal thought it should equal, you then change the rule.
Are you talking about a preconceived notion?
Well, if by notion you mean the body of truths of the Catholic faith and your understanding of them, yes. But
no, only my understanding of them.
Authority,
just to be clear, I'm sorry. Yeah. Just to be clear, I'm only talking about my understanding of them. So yeah. So again, a preconceived notion. My notion is my understanding of what I've been taught as a Catholic, not necessarily what I mean. I could have poorly been taught, or I heard something wrong and I went with it, or I never checked it back out later. So all my life I believe, sometimes in a funny way, just as a sidebar, a lot of times you think a certain movie has a certain scene in it your whole life, and then you find out it was from a different movie. You just remembered it wrong. So I mean
Right, very good point.
So what I'm saying is though, so a preconceived notion of what I okay.
Of what you believe the faith to be.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
right.
It's an epistemological question. How
Right.
do we know what we know?
Right.
And the things that we think the faith is come from the authority of the church. So it gives us this body of truth. So the same standard gives us a body of truth. So if you can imagine, some sort of a rule, and if you can imagine that in your mind, that is a hard and fast universal rule that never changes. And then you basically, when you plug in the data, in other words, you have a whole bunch of truly Catholic popes, they give you a body of teaching, okay?
Mm-hmm.
And then you have, from your point of view, as John Q. Catholic, you have another truly Catholic pope who gives you more teaching, and it should add on. If it's from a true authority, it's nothing but add on to that teaching.
Right.
But what we're doing is basically setting it aside, and we're using that other body of teaching to attack this body of teaching, the new body of teaching, but they came from the exact same rule. The same authority gave us both.
Right.
So they can't create two separate entities. Whatever is created by that rule has to then create the same effect. It can't. If the rule is that it's always safe, you can't say, well, when the rule is applied to traditional Catholic teaching, it is, but when we use the same rule and we apply it to more teaching that should simply dovetail with traditional Catholic teaching, we then question the rule. That's the logical paradox that people who approach that can't get around, because they're basically selectively applying the rule, and when it doesn't work, when they get a result that isn't what they thought it was going to be, they then violate the very rule, gives them that body of teaching by which they could compare anything to in the first place. I mean, the body of teaching, ultimately, that the rule gave us is what we're using to.
Well, I think some of the
sort of through.
Right, but I think some of the problem is, you and I, you more so than me, but you and I are relatively intelligent people now along the lines of this. We've been looking into this for a long time and took the time to really study it, as opposed to John Q, who gets a book from Vatican II and sees this thing. So, but what I was trying to get at is that maybe the religious liberty one wasn't. What I'm trying to say is some things are just clearly not Catholic, and some things are just they can be reconciled. I mean, this is the big argument with the Novus Ordo conservatives, that Vatican II wasn't wrong. It's just that we always, as lay people, we're interpreting them wrong.
Mm-hmm.
You know that argument. I'm sure you've heard it 1,000 times. So,
absolutely.
So it's first off, Vatican II was deliberately vague and very complicated, and shot through with, room to move for people to believe it this way or that way. It was not. It was ambiguous. At least you can say that. So let's talk about something. Are we allowed to make an example that doesn't exist to prove against your paradox? In other words, can I say, what if he picked up a document from Vatican II and it said that Jesus Christ was actually a female and was not born of Mary? I'm just making a huge exaggerative claim. So the John Q Catholic, picks up a Vatican II or a Vatican III document. Let's say Francis calls the third Vatican gone. All right, and in it he says,
"Oh, please don't say that."
I'm sorry for the sake of our argument. So he says, Jesus was actually a woman. So I mean, what is John Q? Does John Q Catholic then violate the rule by going, no, no way? I mean, that's so open and shut.
If he's consistent to what the church teaches, that she cannot teach us error, and he believes that it's from the church, then absolutely he should believe that either the church got it wrong earlier or that both are true, which is exactly what the modernists are doing. They're trying to teach us everything's true, even contradictions are true.
Right, which is
how we're in this mess. Is their whole philosophy is one of constant evolution.
Right, there's no absolute truth.
perpetual state of flux. Exactly. There's no absolute truth. So two contraries can both be true just at different periods of time. So, for example, they would then approach it from a modern psychological point of view and say that, well, Jesus identified with a woman, so he was a woman, because we've changed what it means to be a woman. We've changed it from a biology question,
right? Like they're doing today with the
psychology.
transgenders and the homosexuals today.
If you were the transgender, the hashtag gender fluid,
right, fluid,
that, If you're John Q, you would have to say, well, I guess truth isn't certain as I thought it was. Apparently, it must be able to change, or the sense in which they mean female is different than the sense that they meant male in the past. So maybe in the past when they said he was male, they meant biologically, but now when they say he is female, they simply mean that he's psychologically female. Or maybe they meant that God is a female and that Christ was anatomically and biologically.
I'm not sure.
So we have like a female God and a male.
No, I get the point. Yeah, it's not, you don't have to put too fine a point on it, because I totally understand all the implications of a non, without having a absolute truth. It's phenomenally huge what can happen now. The truth is now open for bids and personal feelings. But that's not what we're talking about. I'm trying to dig down, or trying to drill down to, I think there's a problem with the assertion, because the problem I see with it is that if John Q. Catholic is violating the rule, I'm trying to find a way, because what I'm saying is, I think there not a rule that Christ gave us that we can read of in the scripture about judging by fruits, judge ye righteous judgment. A well cannot give both salty water and brackish water and clear water from the same well. So
correct.
I mean, so
you're arguing backwards, doing the same thing that you can't be doing, because.
Well, that's what I'm asking you. Why can't you do it? Why can't you?
Well, because the difference is that you start with, do I think it's true, and then judging whether it came from the church based upon whether you think it's true.
Yeah, but what you're doing is, but now
whether it's a true authority.
Let me push a little bit.
Then you go to whether it's true.
Fess, let me push a little bit, because this is where the conversation is going to go now. So let me push back a little bit. You're saying that I'm doing this because I should trust the authority, but I mean, isn't there some way that I can know something that's already been taught to me is true just from I'm looking at it? I know this is true as well. No, that's not a very well phrased.
The authority of the church, yes. The things that aren't theological, but when it concerns matters of dogma that are concerning theological truths, the only place you can know with absolute certainty, and the only way you can know with absolute certainty is if the church teaches you as it concerns revealed truth. So things like whether God exists.
Yeah, I agree. Okay. Let me cut you off then. I agree. Okay. Let me cut you off, because what I'm saying is we started this by saying, so he goes back, he takes the document, and he breaks the rule, and now he says, well, I can't believe that Christ would lie to me, and I can't believe that the church would lie to me, so I must believe, my only conclusion, like Sherlock Holmes always said, if you eliminate everything, the last thing is true. I'm not sure that's an absolute truth, but I'm just using it. Anyway, if you eliminate everything, it has to be that he's not the Pope. And I'm not sure what is wrong with using your reasoning power to do that.
Well, there's nothing wrong with using reasoning power to do it. It's just how you get there. So I know what you're saying. What you're saying is true. You're basically saying that you're startled, I think, by me saying this, because your thought process seems to be that, well, how would you ever know that? You can only know the cause by the effect. I mean, in many cases anyway, you don't know the wind blowing until you see the tree moving. So you reason backwards by saying, well, because the tree is moving, I can tell just from being inside that it must be the wind must be blowing.
Right.
So I know you're basically saying, look, there's nothing wrong with blowing the whistle because you see a problem. It's how you get to knowing that there's a problem, though, and identifying it as separate from how you conclude that it is a problem. So if you see a problem in a document, say, or something that concerns you, if you go back and you find that it is from, you go back to the beginning and you say, well, this institution is one holy Catholic apostolic, and there's no other institution in the world that possibly lays claim to any of those marks, let alone all of them.
Right.
That institution has given us this man who is universally recognized as Pope, which is the infallible standard by which we know with absolute certainty who is and who is not the Pope. And then that man gives you this, and we check. We check then that the content of that, or I shouldn't say content, the mechanism by which it was promulgated was legitimate. So it wasn't by an imposter, like who, let's say, drugged the Pope or something like that. It's from his hand.
Okay.
And we can ascertain that as a matter of fact. Then what we get at the end of it is that, well, this therefore must be true, and I must be mistaken about what I thought Catholic doctrine was. And from there, I have to wait for the theologians to do their job. The Church commissions theologians for this purpose to explain developments of doctrine. And by developments, that don't mean changes. It simply means they unpack what a dogma means. And the theologians do that unpacking for us. So when the councils unpack something, or when they expound upon something, they might say something that seems nominally at odds with something that was previously taught. And so we say, St. Ambrose said this over here, or he said this over here, and the theologians say, well, he meant it in this sense, and he meant it in that sense. And at the end of the day, they all do reconcile. And you go, oh, I'm so glad I didn't jump ship and start accusing everybody of heresy, questioning the church and everything, because really Christ is true to his promises. In this case, I wouldn't fault you for being alarmed by something. Being alarmed is not the same as saying that it is a heresy or it is an error, because if he is the true authority and it is a true church, you can't say that without calling Christ a liar. So the proper way for him to go about doing this is not to rely simply on saying, by the judgment perceives error, and I'm going to just accuse everybody of heresy that gave it to me, and that church is false, by the way, and so is your religion too.
Right.
Instead, he should go back and say, okay, what are the principles? What's the standard by which I became Catholic? How do I know what the true church is to begin with? And you look at, well, the marks that Christ gave us, those are antecedent to becoming Catholic. You have to have those. You have to be able to see those marks prior to being Catholic in order to become Catholic.
Yeah, but in your example, Paul VI had those marks, even though he promulgated something that bothered John Q.
He did, from John Q. Catholic's point of view at the time, but we know he didn't.
Right.
And John Q. Catholic, if he actually went back and looked in our example, and he was being honest with himself, I can show you exactly how he would be able to identify that was in fact an error without impugning the legitimate authority of the church.
Show me.
And that's why the other methods are better, because they approach it in a way where you're not questioning the magisterium of the church first, and then going back to prove that everything
I think Fess, the problem is I guess I didn't do it that way either. Well, I guess I did it the right way, because I didn't.
I think you did.
Yeah.
I was kind of wondering why I'm like, you resting it on this one approach, because there's
no. I just took it on myself here to play devil's advocate, and figured for the sake of the conversation, I'm going to try and use the arguments that are going to come against you. And I actually am I convinced that what the paradox was. I guess I'm not guilty of it, so I was a little worried I was. But
well, I've been guilty of it. The tricky approach is kind of a little of both, because I'm not going to say that everyone's going to reevaluate what is the church and where is the church just coincidentally when a Novus Ordo comes out. However, I think that there are huge red flags in that initial address that Paul VI gave the audience, where he laid down the principles of this. And I think he could, in hindsight, it's easier, but I think the red flags should have been going off in everyone's mind when he was making statements tantamount to altering the entire constitution of the church,
right,
as well as statements talking about an entire new order, which is impossible for the constitution.
And changing the mass. I mean, to me, this is a real. We're coming up on an hour in our conversation. We got about 15 minutes, and I'm fine with that, but because it's a really good conversation. But we're talking about documents now. But what about John Q. Public, who comes into St. Matthew's in New York City, and he's been going there since 1942, and he comes in one day and the Novus Ordo is kicked in, the new mass, which is what happened to many people. Now, what does John Q. Catholic do then? Because using the paradox you're saying is dangerous, he would have to either go, this isn't Catholic, or he has to go, oh, okay, I guess the Pope knows what he's doing. Now I'm going to do it this way.
Right. Well, and I'm kind of getting to that, but I was just going to use a different example. But that's a good example because it's probably that's the main way that people saw that there were changes.
Right. Everyday Catholics. Just very few Catholics. Just to be fair, very few Catholics went trolling not trolling is not the right word. Went scheming over all the writings of Vatican II. Very few. You have to be fair too.
Right.
So, but they did see the mass change. They saw their churches turn around. I'm not sure how long it took. I don't know if you're aware. Since I'm Eastern Rite and nothing's really changed, I don't really know how it went about. I have friends who've told me that it actually happened within a week or a month. Everything was different. So, like you said, that must have been terribly jarring, but what is the John Q. Catholic to do then? My friend got up and walked out and then went to the Eastern Rite and never looked back. So.
Well, so he walks into his church and he sees these changes, and he is, like you say, he has every right to be alarmed. His sensus catholicus should be triggered. He should be seeing a problem, and there's nothing wrong with having a Catholic sense. That's been used many times to get us out of a lot of trouble.
Right.
So that's how you identify it first.
Right.
What you do after that is what's important. There's nothing wrong with identifying you have a question.
Right.
There's nothing wrong with questioning something that is going on in the sense of not assuming it is wrong, but saying, this doesn't seem right. Let me try to understand what's going on. Next step, the next step would really be, instead of saying, well, no, this guy who gave me this is a true authority, I don't agree with the mass that he's given me, the form of worship. Well, therefore, he's not a true authority. When a moment ago he was, you're using the rule against itself, the paradox. Then you should do a reflection on, well, how do I know where this truth? How do I know what the true church is? And that's when you start looking.
Yeah. Well, the thing is that what if you, instead of coming to the conclusion, like you said, because you keep bringing this up, I heard you say it a couple times now.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So
my throat went dry there.
Yeah, that's all right. No.
My point.
Okay, so give me a chance to jump in here then. The John Q. Catholic, you keep bringing up the example of he believed he was the Pope a moment before, but then he comes upon this problem, and now he's not a true authority. Well, or is John Q. Catholic saying he never was a true authority, or is he saying, like some of us, that at that moment he no longer had authority?
Either way is false.
Okay.
Either way can happen. There's an intermediary step.
Okay.
And all he has to do is say, well, how do I know where the church is? And if he looks at the marks of the church, he can see that from the day of Pentecost,
it's apostolic.
Pentecost Sunday, all the way up until Vatican II, we have the four marks of the church.
Right.
Now, instead of evaluating this magisterially, evaluate it in the same way you evaluated the church to begin with, before you accepted anything that the Catholic Church teaches specifically.
Right.
One of the things many of the things, but one of the things specifically, the church must always remain apostolic.
Okay.
Now, even if you're not Catholic, you know that apostolic means it must come from the apostles.
Right.
Okay. So we have three pillars by which a religion is distinguished. It's doctrine,
right,
it's discipline, and it's liturgy, also known as its worship.
Right.
So you look at that, three different pillars, if you will, and in identifying them, you don't know anything about what they teach yet. But one thing you know is that if this church does come from Christ, then it must be apostolic. It has to come from the time of Christ. It can't be created before Christ. It can't be created after Christ. It must start with Christ, and it must continue from apostolic times all the way to the present. So whatever we have today must have been given to us by the apostles. Whatever accidental changes are made are organic developments. In the same way I
Right.
use the analogy of a tree being, in a sense, conditioned by its environment, it changes slightly. If he then sees that he's looking through the window of, as a non-Catholic approaching this Novus Ordo and seeing this Mass that's been given to us, now he's looking at the liturgy and saying, okay, well, if it's from the Catholic Church, and it's going to be apostolic. Well, right away he sees, as a matter of fact, not as a matter of teaching, but as a
Right.
matter of fact, the
Right.
historical fact,
Right.
this Mass did not exist at the time of the Apostles.
Right.
This form is a hodgepodge. It's like they cut up a tree,
Right.
and in trying to make it look like a true tree, they cut it up and they nail it together, and parts went over here and some branches got melded over there,
Right.
and they say it's the same thing. It looks like a tree, right?
Right.
Well, it is in some sense a tree, but it is not an organic tree. And the organic tree must be a development from the seed. It has to come from the seed, and you can't be nailing
Right.
additional branches on and hacking things apart from history. But the Novus Ordo is by nature is a historical hodgepodge, an antiquarianistic dream, where they basically reached back into history, pulled out choice parts, pulled some stuff from the Seder meals from the Jews, and they pulled some stuff a little bit maybe from the Masons, and they pulled some stuff from history that they liked that at that time hadn't been as fully developed yet doctrinally. So we're able to give it a new sense in modern times. It has a different sense now when we
Right.
say certain things.
It's a meal.
We kind
Not
of
a
nail this
sacrifice.
thing together, and we take this thing that is not at all apostolic, and we say, well, wait a second. If this is not an apostolic liturgy, then the institution that gave it to me is not it can't be apostolic,
Right.
because it is giving me something apostolic, which is if the true church can only do things that are apostolic, or where we have a new church. So right away, just by seeing the new Mass, we should see a lack of apostolicity in the body, or the institution that gave us this. And as soon as you see that lack of apostolicity, there's a new church, there's a new religion created immediately. You can tell that, because it's lacking one of the four marks by which Christ promised his path, and the Old Testament prophesied to. Do you have a new church?
What resource?
When we have a new church, remember that the man who gave you that liturgy claims to be head of that church. He says, I'm head of this Novus Ordo.
Right.
So we have a new church. We have the man now claiming to be head of that. Well, if it's a false church and he's claiming to be head of it, right away we have doubtfully head of the Catholic Church. He can't be head of both.
Right.
So
what
you can't necessarily
resources?
say
What
he absolutely
resources?
and certainly is not head of the church, but you can say he's doubtfully.
Right. Well,
and now you can view his magisterial proclamations under the lens of doubt.
Right, but you've put up a litmus test of the four pillars of the church. Is this from the church? Which is a simplified way of doing it. But my question, I guess, would be, what resources would John Q. Catholic use to test his theory that this isn't apostolic? I mean, how would the taxi driver from New York, who's still a faithful Catholic, but he's a taxi driver from New York, come in? How would he know whether it's apostolic or not? Unless he did some research and started reading documents, which seems to bring you back to what you say is the wrong way to go about it.
Well, he might not know, but then you have to question the taxi driver and how he got to think this was the true church to begin with. How did the Catholic come to find the true church without using the marks of the church? In some way, he has to use the marks of the church by saying, well, this is the only true form of the liturgy. Why? Because it came from Christ. So if the taxi driver is driving in and is not saying it's a false religion from the get-go, but he's converting to it, then how does he know that what he was converting to was the true church to begin with? He wasn't using the correct standards by which he
right. And then what you're pointing,
he could walk into any church and say, "Well, this is a true church," even if it.
Right. So what you're pointing out, Fess, what you're pointing out then is what could be maybe the cradle Catholic who just because Mom told me this St. Matthew's was the right church, so therefore this is the church. As opposed to somebody who has a true faith and learned his catechism really well. I mean, I can't say that about myself. I didn't really get any catechism class, unfortunately, when I was young.
Well, I would disagree that it is only something that a cradle Catholic would see, because a convert should
No, it's the reverse. It's the reverse. You have me wrong. I didn't say it was something only a cradle Catholic would see.
Okay.
Just the reverse. I'm saying the cradle Catholic might miss it. He might miss that it's not apostolic because he simply was. I know a lot of Catholics like this. Well, this is where you go just because this is the Catholic Church.
Well, I guess it depends on where. If you live through the changes, that's different, because we started with a person who walks in one day and something's different, and you ask me, well, how does he know?
Right.
Well, he knows because it's not what he just had, and he knows what he had was apostolic. Now it's a new mass, which, but the very fact that it's
I guess
altered,
my point is that maybe he didn't,
but
maybe he didn't know the church before was apostolic either. He was just there because his parents baptized him Catholic. We always went here every Sunday.
Well, if he has made his first Holy Communion, he should know that. If he's been confirmed, he should know that, because that's a condition the Church requires to even do those things. You have to know the nature of the Church to be receiving these extremely important sacraments in the Church.
But you're assuming that some kids didn't just go through and memorize what the bishop wanted to hear him say, and then he smacks them on the face and they go to their little party. You know what I'm saying? There's
if he doesn't, then he's responsible for his lack of knowing. You're saying, well, how is he at fault? Well, he's at fault because he doesn't take his religion seriously.
Right. Well, I guess fault wasn't the right word. I mean, did I say fault? I don't remember saying fault.
Well, you didn't say fault, but you said that he didn't take it seriously. I think.
Right.
Not taking his religion
I'm just saying
that
these people really exist is my point. That's not. I mean, I think sometimes we use the scale of everybody who knows their catechism is really good, and that's everybody. But I mean, there's still a lot of people.
Well, at this point, you're getting into a standard that only God can judge, because you're making it so subjective in his mind that I can't possibly evaluate it, and so it's extremely subjective. Where he's going along with emotions. Only God can judge whether he's culpable for just going along with emotions. If he's going along with emotions because he can't understand things, again, that's God as the judge of whether or not he will ever find this, because maybe he has sort of a mental handicap that prevents him from fully understanding this. But at some point, God's grace opens the mind of the intellect, and that's kind of the point of confirmation.
Right.
At some point, you're supposed to internalize what these things mean.
Well, that must be why I was able to get it, because as an Eastern Rite, I was confirmed at baptism.
Right.
Try to figure that one out.
Well, that's a whole different discussion.
Yeah, that's right. It is.
Is better, but
all right. Well, so I'm gonna try and bring this thing for a landing. I think that was an excellent discussion. I'm glad to know I'm not totally guilty of the paradox. I do see it clearer now that they're using a double standard, but I'm not sure if that. You see, but just real quick, I always thought a paradox was something that is okay to have, but it goes around itself, so the human mind can't figure it out. I mean, if there's other classical paradoxes in science and in math and stuff, that it's not necessarily that you're wrong, that the paradox is a bad thing. It's just that it is what it is, and we have to learn to live with it.
Well, paradoxes are a logical contradiction is, I believe, the best definition of paradox that I've seen.
Okay.
It's where two things contradict each other completely, logically speaking. They can't, say, a paradox would be that the cause in our four dimensions, anyway, a cause causes an effect, which caused the cause. It's a paradox because our minds can't even wrap their head around the fact that if cause the cause, which causes the effect, it goes around in circles, like you said, but it goes around in circles because it's a logical paradox, because it doesn't make any sense, because it's self-contradictory.
Yeah, but whose fault is it?
It just doesn't. I'm sorry.
Well, then, it might just be a case of our hardware is not up to the task, not necessarily that the concept is.
Well, if you do that, then the entire 5 proofs by which we prove values have completely been demolished, because the very idea that we know that a cause. Well,
let's remember. I'm just playing devil's advocate here. I'm just trying to throw out what I think an objection might be.
Well, if you did that, then you would be completely undermining logical thought completely, because logical thought, there would be couldn't make an ontological statement. No statement would have any ontological meaning. No reality would have any sort of meaning.
Well, it seems to me,
in America, couldn't exist in a with a philosophy like that.
Well, it seems to me that's where America is about today. I mean, we've really come. Yes, we've really come to a place where it's just like complete insanity. I mean, where really people have no anchor to anchor their truths to, and so they're just winging it. I mean, and it's a terrifying society to be in where there's no absolutes. Because somewhere,
well, I think it's even worse than a pre-Christian society, because
right.
A pre-Christian society hasn't accepted Christ and rejected him, whereas a post-Christian society is vindictive. They want to eradicate and erase what they had, and they will try to replace it with not just immorality, but with spiteful immorality. And that's where I think you're extremely right, because people say, well, it's been bad before. Well, it has been bad before, but
no, not
we
this
have
bad.
a very vindictive, hateful society that has now embraced Christ and has now completely rejected him and turned on him, much like Judas.
Right.
And that is a entirely different condition from Judas before he met Christ. He was probably better off before he met Christ.
Well, we can be happy, Fest, to know that tonight we defended solid absolutes, and we were doing our best as lay people to do our best to make society better by discussing something with some logical consistency and vigor. Correct?
Correct.
Correct.